What if I told you that the greatest empire fell because of a single insane order issued on a deserted shore? In the morning, 500 people woke up hoping to return home, and by evening found themselves trapped on a foreign continent. The decision to burn their own ships permanently closed the path back and set in motion an irreversible shift in global power. It was not merely a strategic ploy, but a profound psychological break that forced people to press forward for the sake of mere survival.
Imagine what it's like to find yourself in complete isolation when retreat means certain death.
And ahead lies only the unknown and hostile lands. In today's video, we'll take a detailed look at exactly how this fateful decision was made and why the commander took such a colossal risk, which today seems like absolute madness. Be sure to watch this video all the way to the end to find out exactly how the loss of the fleet transformed a desperate group of people into an invincible force capable of shattering the centuries-old foundations of a mighty civilization. Additionally,
Halfway through the video, we'll reveal one of the main mysteries of this expedition, which researchers still debate to this day.
are you ready to learn the truth about the most desperate morning of the 16th century? The heavy wooden hulls of the Spanish galleons slowly sank into the dark waters of the bay under the gaze of hundreds of sailors. Huge masts snapped and sank beneath the water, taking with them the last link to the familiar world. 500 men stood on the sandy shore, cut off from their homeland by thousands of miles of ocean. Their faces expressed complete bewilderment at what was happening and a growing inner chill. The expedition commander walked personally between the ranks of the frozen soldiers. His footsteps on the wet sand sounded unnaturally loud in the silence hanging over the shore. He did not deliver impassioned speeches or attempt to calm the panic beginning to spread among his men. This calculated move was aimed at completely destroying the very idea of a possible retreat. Now, the expedition had only one course of action left: to head deep into the unexplored continent. Conspiracies and escape plans began to take shape among the soldiers almost immediately. Several men attempted to secretly gather the remaining provisions and hide in the dense forests along the coast. These attempts were quickly quashed by officers loyal to the commander without any fuss. Discipline was restored through the realization of their complete isolation and each person's dependence on the group. The men realized that any disunity would lead to their inevitable demise in these wild lands. The destruction of the fleet altered the very physical balance of power along the coast. Previously, the ships had served as floating fortresses, warehouses, and a guarantee of safety in the event of the expedition's failure.
Now, 500 people had become a tiny speck on the edge of a vast continental shelf.
They were deprived of the protection of heavy shipboard artillery and the fresh water supplies in the holds. They would have to learn to obtain resources solely by advancing through foreign territory. This psychological blow worked exactly as the leadership had intended. The realization that escape was impossible forced the soldiers to mobilize all their inner reserves. Fear of the unknown gave way to a cold determination to survive at any cost in the coming clashes. Every man in the ranks understood his personal responsibility for the success of the collective advance. There was no turning back. All that remained was to conquer this new reality. Local residents watched from a distance as the strangers destroyed their own means of transportation. To them, this act seemed utterly devoid of any logical sense. However, they soon realized the true scale of the ambitions of the people who had arrived on their land. The refusal to retreat demonstrated a confidence that inspired both respect and alarm. This step became the first powerful signal to the rulers of the mighty empire deep within the continent. The dynamics of that morning determined the further course of the entire campaign. The detachment could no longer afford long stops or waiting in position. The The loss of mobility on the water was compensated for by aggressive speed of advance on land. Every delay threatened to deplete resources and lose the initiative in an unfamiliar environment. The men had become like coiled springs, ready to spring at the slightest provocation.
Gradually, the panic on shore gave way to a grim and focused organization of the camp.
Weapons were cleaned with particular zeal, and the remaining supplies were distributed with the utmost economy. The soldiers' gazes turned more and more frequently toward the high mountains on the horizon. There lay the goal of their expedition and their only chance to make up for the lost ships. The group began to transform from a research expedition into a full-fledged invasion army. The destruction of the ships marked a point of no return in the history of the two civilizations. Had the fleet remained intact, the expedition could have limited itself to simple trade along the coast. The presence of escape routes always leaves room for doubt and weakness at a critical moment. By cutting off that route, the commander deprived himself and his men of the right to make a mistake. The stakes instantly soared to the highest possible level. Ahead lay high mountain passes, unfamiliar climatic conditions, and a clash with a massive military machine. Their only chance lay in swift decision-making and iron discipline. That day remained forever etched in their memory as a moment of deepest despair and the birth of new strength. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about such a radical method of motivating people in extreme conditions? Share your thoughts in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Guess what happened next when 500 people stepped into the unknown? The detachment left the sandy shore and began a slow advance through the dense jungle thickets. The humid climate and heavy armor greatly slowed their pace. The soldiers cut paths with machetes, expending enormous effort for every kilometer of the journey. The landscape varied from flat plains to steep foothills, requiring constant adjustments to their tactics. Soon, they encountered the first large settlements of local inhabitants. The architecture of these cities was strikingly different from anything the Europeans had seen before. The stone structures and the strict layout of the streets testified to a high level of engineering expertise. Contact with the local population took place in an atmosphere of mutual distrust and constant tension. The expedition had to project confidence while concealing its small numbers and vulnerability. Diplomatic negotiations were accompanied by demonstrations of the technological superiority of European weapons. Metal armor and the thunderous roar of firearms made a strong impression on the city rulers. The detachment commander skillfully used these factors to pressure local leaders. He demanded loyalty and the provision of supplies to continue his campaign. Every agreement was precarious and could collapse at any moment.
As they advanced deeper into the continent, the scale of the threat grew steadily.
Small towns gave way to large regional centers with their own military garrisons. The detachment found itself drawn into the internal political conflicts of an unfamiliar world. The commander had to balance between various factions, promising support to some and threatening others. This political game required incredible composure and an analytical mind. The advanced strategy was based on maintaining strict formation under any conditions. The infantry moved in tight groups, covering each other with long pikes against surprise attacks. Cavalrymen served as mobile strike units capable of quickly changing the direction of the attack. Such tactics allowed them to effectively repel attacks by superior enemy forces in open terrain. Discipline in formation became the key to survival in every new engagement. A powerful regional power, independent of the main empire, stood in the detachment's path. Here, diplomacy failed, and the conflict escalated into open confrontation. The clash with a massive army of local warriors became the first serious test of endurance.
The Europeans had to employ all their tactical skills to hold their positions.
The balance of power was disrupted, and the detachment had to withstand immense pressure. This confrontation ended in an unexpected political alliance against a common enemy. The former adversaries recognized the Europeans' strength and agreed to join their march on the capital. The detachment suddenly swelled with thousands of allied warriors who knew the terrain perfectly. The very nature of the campaign changed, transforming from a mere adventure into a large-scale military campaign. Now, the United Army posed a real threat to the continent's most powerful state. The pressure continued to mount, and the capital was only a few days' march away. The city on the lake beckoned with its riches and frightened with its unknowns. The Allies spoke of impregnable walls and a massive army defending the capital. Every step forward narrowed the room for political maneuvering. Are you ready to learn how a handful of foreigners decided to enter this labyrinth from which there was no escape? I discovered this by chance while studying the ancient chronicles of that time. It turns out that the detachment's advance was accompanied by an extremely complex information campaign that preceded the physical march. The expedition commander actively spread rumors about his invincibility and the supernatural origins of his people. These narratives were deliberately transmitted through messengers and merchants deep into the continent. The information war prepared the ground for the detachment's arrival, sowing doubt among local rulers. A key element of the strategy was the skillful exploitation of the internal contradictions within the vast empire. The state consisted of numerous conquered cities that paid heavy tribute to the central authority. The Europeans positioned themselves as liberators, ready to dismantle the old system of subjugation. This stance drew thousands of discontented people to their side, shifting the balance of power in the region.
It was a masterclass in political analysis under conditions of extreme information scarcity.
Each new alliance was cemented by strict treaties and commitments to supply the army. The campaign's logistics network began to rely on the resources of local city-states. The detachment no longer depended on its own meager supplies, relying instead on the warehouses of its allies. This allowed them to significantly increase their pace of advance and focus exclusively on military objectives. The organization of supplies became the foundation for subsequent large-scale operations. Meetings with envoys from the central government turned into sophisticated diplomatic duels. Both sides concealed their true intentions behind masks of politeness and formal ceremonies. The envoys offered lavish gifts in exchange for a halt to the advance. The commander accepted the gifts but found new pretexts to continue his march toward the capital. This game of nerves wore both sides down, but inexorably brought the climax closer. The communication system within the United Army became a serious challenge for the command. Transmitting orders to thousands of Allied soldiers required a precise chain of interpreters. Any inaccuracy in translation could lead to a fatal mistake on the battlefield. To solve this problem, a special group of trusted individuals was formed to oversee the transmission of information. Communication became as vital a weapon as steel swords and firearms. The psychological pressure on the soldiers grew as they approached the heart of the empire. The vast cities and complex engineering structures were overwhelming in their scale. The men understood that in the event of defeat, their new allies would instantly switch sides to the victor. Their only salvation lay in absolute confidence in their own strength and iron discipline. Any sign of weakness could trigger the collapse of the entire coalition. Tension reached its peak as they approached the entrance to the mountain valley where the capital was located. The Empire's last defensive lines had been abandoned without a fight, which aroused serious suspicion. No one knew whether this was a sign of surrender or a carefully planned trap. The commander decided to press on, raising the alert level to maximum.
The detachment took the final step toward the continent's greatest mystery.
Ahead lay a vast lake, in the center of which stood a city of incredible size. Long causeways connected the island capital to the shores, creating a perfect access control system. This sight forever changed Europeans' perception of the possibilities of urban planning far from the familiar world. Appreciate the scale of this engineering marvel, and don't forget to like this video. If you enjoy this approach to history, be sure to support the channel with a like. What went on behind the closed doors of this city remained a secret for many years. Entering via the long causeways was like walking a tightrope. Surrounded by water on both sides, people realized there was absolutely no room for maneuver or sudden retreat. The capital's residents watched the column in silence from the rooftops and hundreds of light boats. The deafening silence of the vast metropolis weighed on the psyche more heavily than any open battle. In the city center, the detachment was housed in a spacious complex of palace buildings. The thick stone walls gave the illusion of safety, but in reality, turned the palace into a luxurious prison. All exits were controlled by huge crowds of locals, completely blocking any possibility of independent movement. Food supplies depended entirely on the goodwill of the empire's ruler. The situation gradually shifted from an active offensive to a deep strategic crisis. The expedition commander made an unprecedented decision to seize the initiative. During a diplomatic meeting, the ruler of the empire was isolated and taken into custody in his own palace. This move instantly shifted the political balance, turning the ruler into a hostage within his own capital. The Europeans attempted to govern the vast state through the orders of the captured leader. Power formally remained the same, but the levers of control passed into the hands of foreigners. The city continued to go about its business, building up internal discontent with the situation. The local elites began to realize that the foreigners were vulnerable and too few in number to hold the capital. Unbeknownst to the Europeans, the gathering of armed forces and preparations for a large-scale resistance began. The tension in the air became almost physically palpable, foreshadowing an inevitable social explosion. Every day spent in the city drained the detachment's resources and morale. Isolation inside the palace forced the Europeans to fortify their temporary base. Windows were bricked up, and new firing positions were created for artillery and riflemen. The perimeter was patrolled around the clock, exhausting the men with a lack of proper sleep. The information vacuum made it impossible to assess the true scale of the threat brewing in the neighboring streets. The palace had turned into a besieged fortress long before open hostilities began. Suddenly, the situation was complicated by news from the distant coast of the continent. A large military detachment had landed there, sent to arrest the expedition commander for acting on his own authority. The commander was forced to divide his already meager forces, leaving part of his men in the capital. He made a rapid march to the sea to neutralize the new threat through diplomacy and a surprise attack. This operation was a resounding success, and his army even gained new recruits. However, during his absence, a catastrophic mistake was made by the garrison left behind in the capital. Nervous tension led to a preemptive strike by the Europeans against the local elite during a major city festival. This event became the spark that ignited the powder keg of pent-up popular anger. The entire vast city instantly rose up in an armed rebellion against a handful of foreigners. The policy of containment through hostage-taking had finally collapsed. The retreat plan called for a covert movement under cover of night along one of the long dams. Soldiers were building portable wooden bridges to cross the destroyed sections of the path. The gold and valuables gathered in the palace had become a heavy burden, dragging the people down. Everyone understood that the upcoming march would be the most dangerous ordeal in the entire history of the expedition. What consequences do you think this desperate nighttime attempt to leave the besieged city will bring? The retreat began amid thick clouds and pouring rain, which muffled the sound of footsteps. The column slowly made its way out of the palace, trying to maintain absolute silence in the narrow streets. Artillery and heavy equipment were abandoned to maximize the speed of the retreat. The first few hundred meters passed unnoticed, giving false hope for a successful and bloodless outcome. However, the silence was soon shattered by the alarm calls of sentries who had spotted the movement of foreigners on the dam. The water around the dam instantly filled with hundreds of combat boats attacking the retreating column. The narrow space prevented the Europeans from forming ranks and effectively using their firearms. A portable wooden bridge got stuck in the very first channel, depriving the detachment of the ability to cross the subsequent breaches in the dam. A chaotic process began as they swam across the water barriers under a hail of flying projectiles. Discipline collapsed, and every man fought solely for his own life. The heavy metal armor, which had previously served as reliable protection, had now become a deadly anchor. Many soldiers, weighed down by the treasures they had gathered, sank beneath the water without even reaching the opposite bank. The column's rearguard was completely cut off and forced to retreat back to the besieged palace. The organized retreat turned into a catastrophic breakout through a tight encirclement. The loss of control over the situation reached its historic peak. The survivors made their way to dry land completely exhausted and demoralized. The detachment had lost most of its men, nearly all of its horses, and all of its firearms. It was a moment of profound crisis when the ambitious military campaign seemed definitively lost. The commander, sitting under a tree, watched the pitiful remnants of his once formidable army. The psychological pressure of that night forever changed the character of every surviving member. Now, the top priority was an organized retreat to the territory of loyal allies. The march through hostile territory without artillery or supplies became a true test of endurance. Local units constantly harassed the column from the flanks, leaving no time for proper rest. Movement consisted of short marches from one natural shelter to another. Survival depended on the men's ability to maintain formation even in a state of extreme exhaustion. In one of the valleys, a massive army of pursuers awaited the retreating forces, blocking the path to safety. The Europeans found themselves outnumbered, with no room to maneuver in the open terrain. It seemed that this battle would be the final episode of their long stay on the continent. The commander made the only correct decision, to launch a precision strike against the enemy's command center. A group of horsemen broke through the enemy lines and eliminated the local army's chief commander. The loss of their leader instantly threw the pursuers into disarray, allowing the Europeans to break out of the encirclement. This tactical success restored the detachment's confidence and shattered their victim mentality. The column finally reached the lands of their allies, where they were able to halt for a prolonged recovery. The crisis had been overcome, but the scale of the losses demanded a complete reevaluation of the future strategy. The campaign entered a phase of protracted planning and the accumulation of new resources. The unit gradually regained its combat effectiveness as it received reinforcements from the coast. New weapons, gunpowder, and horses were delivered through established supply chains that wound their way through the jungle. Slowly but surely, the balance of power began to shift back in favor of the United Coalition. The experience of the crushing defeat was analyzed in detail and incorporated into new tactical plans. Extensive preparations heralded the start of the longest and most grueling siege in the continent's history. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in the methods used to conduct this siege. The commander did not plan a direct assault on the fortified positions, preferring a strategy of completely exhausting the enemy. The first step was the destruction of the aqueduct that supplied the vast city with fresh water from the mainland. This operation deprived the metropolis of over 1 million people of its primary lifeline within a matter of hours. The city found itself trapped on a saltwater lake, completely dependent on meager reserves of rainwater. Then, a fleet of light, maneuverable ships equipped with artillery was deployed. They blocked the movement of local transport boats, completely cutting off food supplies to the capital. The lake, which had previously served as a protective barrier, turned into an insurmountable wall for the city's residents. Control of the waterways allowed the Europeans to safely move their troops between the various dams. The initiative finally shifted to the besiegers, who dictated the terms of the blockade. The infantry began a methodical advance along the dams, destroying the enemy's defensive structures. Every meter of progress was secured by the construction of temporary shelters for riflemen and artillerymen. The destroyed sections of the bridges were filled with stones and debris, creating a reliable path for the cavalry. Local defenders put up fierce resistance, turning every street into a front line. The pace of the advance was extremely slow, but absolutely relentless and methodical. A deep systemic crisis began within the city due to a shortage of basic resources. The lack of clean water and food led to the rapid physical exhaustion of the capital's defenders. The enormous population density in a confined space greatly exacerbated the logistical disaster. City leaders attempted to organize the distribution of remaining provisions, but the management system began to break down. The invisible enemy of attrition proved far more effective than the besiegers' cannons and swords. The Europeans employed a tactic of gradually destroying the city's infrastructure, block by block. Buildings were razed to the ground, depriving the defenders of the ability to fire from rooftops and upper floors. Wide avenues appeared in place of dense buildings, ideal for cavalry attacks. This process radically changed the appearance of the ancient city, erasing its architectural heritage. The space narrowed, pushing the defenders toward the very center of the island's capital. The Allied coalition forces carried out a massive amount of work to support the siege's logistics. They delivered materials to fill in the canals and secured a safety perimeter around the camps. Their participation allowed the European core of the army to focus exclusively on assault operations. Without this colossal support, maintaining such a prolonged siege would have been physically impossible. The coalition operated as a single, well-coordinated mechanism aimed at destroying the old empire. Psychological warfare continued in parallel with engineering and military operations. The besiegers regularly urged the defenders to surrender, demonstrating their superiority in resources. However, the city's new leaders rejected any negotiations, choosing a strategy of resistance to the very end. This intransigence forced the Europeans to continue the systematic destruction of every city block. The conflict entered a phase of total confrontation, precluding any compromises. The vast city, once awe-inspiring in its grandeur, had turned into a labyrinth of ruins. The last defenders held a narrow strip of land on the outskirts of the island. The commander was preparing to give the order for the final assault, which was to bring this campaign to a close. The outcome of the siege was predetermined by the coalition's logistical and technological superiority. What do you think will happen to the great empire after the fall of its main symbol of power? The final stage of the siege was marked by the complete suppression of the last pockets of organized resistance. European troops and their allies methodically combed through the remaining neighborhoods of the ruined city. The empire's administration ceased to exist with the fall of the central palace complexes. The capture of the last ruler on a boat, as he attempted to flee the city, marked a symbolic turning point in this war. The massive state apparatus that had kept the continent in fear collapsed overnight. After active hostilities ceased, silence fell, broken only by the sounds of collapsing structures. The vast city lay in ruins, having completely lost its original architectural appearance. The metropolis's infrastructure had been destroyed to such an extent that it had become uninhabitable. The victors were left with a territory requiring colossal efforts to clear and rebuild. The problem of managing the devastated area presented itself to the command with absolute inevitability. The primary task was to organize the evacuation of the surviving residents beyond the island capital. People were leaving the ruins en masse, heading to mainland settlements in search of food and shelter. This process was strictly controlled by European patrols to prevent further unrest. The city quickly emptied, turning into a gigantic monument to the concluded military campaign. The movement of vast masses of people altered the demographic map of the entire surrounding region. The complex process of distributing the captured spoils among the expedition members began. The treasures of the great empire were meticulously accounted for and divided according to strict rules of subordination. However, the actual amount of valuables found turned out to be significantly less than most soldiers had expected. This sparked a wave of discontent and suspicions that the command was hiding part of the gold. Internal tension within the victorious contingent became a new problem for the expedition leader. The allied city-states that had participated in the siege expected the promised political privileges. They hoped for the creation of a new system of equal partnership without the rigid dictates of the central authority. The commander had to draw on all his political skill to maintain control over the coalition. He bestowed new titles and lands upon loyal rulers, thereby consolidating his personal power in the region. The former empire was replaced by a new system of dependency oriented toward the overseas metropolis. To cement this success, construction of a new capital began right on the ruins of the old metropolis. Stones from the destroyed temples were used to build European administrative buildings and fortresses. The street layout was altered to meet the standards of colonial architecture of the time. The lake began to be gradually drained, altering the hydrological balance of the entire vast valley. This engineering project symbolized the complete erasure of the past and the beginning of a new historical era. The continent's information sphere reacted instantly to the collapse of central authority. The empire's distant provinces ceased paying tribute and declared their independence. European forces had to launch new campaigns to bring these territories under control. Local conflicts flared up everywhere, requiring a constant military presence in various regions. The conquest process shifted from a phase of concentrated strikes to a stage of systematic territorial expansion. The emergence of a new center of power radically altered trade and logistics routes across the continent. Resources were now directed not to local elites, but to the coast for shipment overseas. New roads were built connecting mountain mines with port cities. The region's economy was completely restructured to meet the needs of a distant European monarchy. This logistical shift shaped the continent's economic development for centuries to come. The expedition commander, who had achieved the impossible, found himself in a difficult political position. His success aroused envy and apprehension at the royal court in his distant homeland. Officials and inspectors began arriving in the new colony, sent to limit his authority. The man who had conquered an empire was forced to defend his rights in bureaucratic offices. Military triumphs gave way to grueling legal battles and endless reports to the monarch. The era of great conquerors was gradually giving way to the era of colonial administrators. Soldiers, accustomed to constant risk and military spoils, became landowners and administrators. Strict military discipline gave way to a complex system of legal codes and tax obligations. Society began to transform, blending features of the European order with local traditions. This synthesis gave rise to an entirely new culture that forever changed the face of the entire continent. The integration of the continent into the global coordinate system began with large-scale mapping of the territories. Geographers and engineers drew up detailed plans of coastlines, mountain ranges, and riverbeds. This data held immense strategic value for the further expansion of colonial holdings. Previously unknown lands took on clear contours on European navigational charts. Information became the primary tool for controlling vast, unexplored territories. The process of reorganization required a massive workforce and vast quantities of building materials. A strict system for allocating labor resources among the local population was established. People were sent to build roads, work in mines, and construct new cities. This labor logistics system made it possible to establish basic colonial infrastructure in the shortest possible time. The effectiveness of governance depended directly on the ability to control the movement of large masses of people. A crucial step was the introduction of new crops and farming methods. The Europeans brought with them previously unknown species of plants, domestic animals, and tools. Iron plows and draft animals radically transformed soil cultivation techniques in the region. Agriculture became more intensive, providing food for the growing colonial cities. A massive biological exchange took place, forever altering the ecosystem of the entire continent. The introduction of a new legal system shattered the millennia-old foundations of local society. Laws from the distant metropolis began to regulate all spheres of life, from land disputes to trade. Courts and administrative bodies were established to strictly enforce the established rules. The transition to bureaucratic governance was painful and met with local resistance. However, it was precisely this system that ensured stability and long-term control over the conquered territories. The construction of port facilities along the coast became a priority for the new administration. Massive forts were built to protect harbors from potential attacks by pirates and rival powers. Docks were equipped with cranes and warehouses to ensure the rapid loading of goods onto ships. Ports became major logistics hubs connecting the new continent with the rest of the world. The oceans ceased to be a barrier, transforming into a bustling transportation artery. The mining industry became the driving force of the new territory's economies. The discovery of rich silver deposits required the use of advanced engineering solutions for their development. The mines extended deep underground, requiring complex ventilation and dewatering systems. The metal was smelted on site and transported to the coast under heavy guard. This flow of wealth had a tremendous impact on the economic development of all of Europe. Changes to the communication system became the foundation of colonial administration. A network of courier routes was established, allowing orders to be delivered quickly to the most remote provinces. Horses, previously unknown on the continent, became the primary means of rapid information transmission. The speed of response to local crises increased significantly, strengthening the power of the central administration. Control over the roads meant control over the entire vast territory. The consequences of a single morning decision on the coast grew to planetary proportions. The order to burn the ships set off a chain reaction that led to the birth of a new world. The isolated continent was forever drawn into global economic and political processes. The course of history changed direction, yielding to the will of a handful of determined individuals. This transformation became one of the most ambitious engineering and social projects in human history. The logistics system that was created united the two hemispheres into a single economic space. Fleets of heavy transport ships regularly crossed the ocean, carrying goods, people, and information. This transatlantic artery demanded the highest level of organization and navigational skill. Huge shipyards were built to repair and construct new ships capable of withstanding severe storms. Maritime logistics became the lifeblood of the new global empire. A complex network of internal trade routes developed within the continent. Caravans of mules replaced the manual labor of porters, greatly increasing the volume of goods transported. Roads were built to accommodate the complex mountainous terrain, forming reliable transport corridors. Security along the routes was ensured by a network of small forts and patrol units. Economic connectivity between regions became the guarantor of the colony's political stability. The technological gap between civilizations was quickly bridged through forced modernization. Local craftsmen mastered European methods of working with metal, stone, and wood. Manufactories emerged, producing textiles, weapons, and tools for the colony's internal needs. Engineering knowledge was transmitted through the practice of building bridges, dams, and aqueducts. The continent was rapidly catching up with Europe in technological development. Water management remained a critical task for sustaining life in the vast cities. The drainage of the lake in the valley of the old capital continued for decades, requiring constant engineering surveys. Complex systems of drainage canals were built to divert floodwaters away from the city walls. Control over the valley's water balance demonstrated the triumph of European engineering over the forces of nature. This work permanently altered the landscape of the central part of the continent. The architectural appearance of the cities was finally shaped in the style of monumental colonial architecture. Central squares were adorned with massive administrative buildings featuring thick stone walls. Streets were laid out in a strict rectangular grid, convenient for control and defense. Every building was constructed with the region's frequent earthquakes in mind. The architecture served as a visual affirmation of the new regime's unshakable authority. The colony's financial system became a crucial mechanism in the structure of the global economy. The minting of silver coins standardized trade across several continents. Mints were high-tech enterprises with a strict quality control system. This money financed armies, the construction of fleets, and palaces throughout Europe. The region became the main economic engine of that historical period. Defending the borders of these vast territories required constant adaptation of military strategy. The northern territories were subject to raids by nomadic tribes employing new tactics of cavalry raids. To provide defense, a line of autonomous fortified settlements was established, capable of withstanding a prolonged siege. The logistics of supplying these distant frontiers were incredibly complex due to the vast distances involved. Military engineering at the borders was constantly being improved in response to new threats. The development of the mining industry gave rise to new forms of social organization of labor. Workers' settlements around the mines grew into large cities with their own specific infrastructure. Supplying these remote industrial centers with food and equipment stimulated the development of neighboring regions. Complex logistics chains were formed, linking agricultural plains with mountain mines. The economic geography of the continent was taking on its modern contours. Bureaucratic control over the territory intensified with each passing decade. Complex taxation systems were introduced, accounting for all types of economic activity. Censuses became increasingly detailed, recording the social status of every resident. The archives of the colonial administration turned into gigantic repositories of statistical data. The state sought to control every aspect of life in the territories under its control. Studying the history of this region provides insight into the mechanisms of global empire building. The success of the campaign depended not only on military superiority, but also on competent logistics and diplomacy. The ability to adapt quickly and manage crises decisively became a decisive factor in victory. Historical processes are often determined by leaders' ability to make radical, irreversible decisions. The experience of this continent's transformation is a unique example of an accelerated infrastructure leap. Decades later, the continent was unrecognizable. Where narrow Indian trails had once run, wide, paved roads for wheeled transport now stretched out. Freight wagons shuttled between cities, ensuring the uninterrupted flow of goods across the vast region. Stone-arched bridges spanned the turbulent rivers, facilitating travel during the rainy season. The logistics of the space were entirely subject to the laws of commercial efficiency. Administering vast territories required standardization across all spheres of the state apparatus. A unified system of weights and measures, simplified trade operations and tax calculations. Standardized administrative procedures allowed officials in different provinces to understand one another. Building codes strictly regulated the thickness of walls and the width of streets in new settlements. Standardization became the primary tool for preventing the empire from falling apart. Maintaining the fleet required the development of shipbuilding technologies on the continent itself. Suitable types of wood were found for making masts and hull planking. The production of sailcloth and ropes was established on an industrial scale at local factories. Port docks allowed for complex repairs of ocean-going galleons after arduous voyages. Self-sufficiency in maintaining logistics routes increased the reliability of the entire imperial system. The role of military engineers gradually shifted to civilian builders and architects. Huge reservoirs were constructed to ensure the uninterrupted operation of mines during dry seasons. The design of urban water supply systems became increasingly complex and well thought out. The infrastructure was developed with the expectation that it would be used for centuries by future generations. Stone and concrete replaced the temporary wooden structures of the early years of colonization. The colony's administrative apparatus evolved into a complex and sluggish bureaucratic structure. Any decision required approval from dozens of agencies on both sides of the ocean. This system was unwieldy, but it reliably protected against the arbitrariness of local leaders. The balance of power was maintained through constant oversight of one agency by another. The stability of the system became more important than the speed of operational decision-making. The world's political landscape shifted under the pressure of the colossal resources extracted from the continent. The metropolis was able to finance protracted wars in Europe by relying on colonial revenues. The geopolitical balance shifted in favor of the powers controlling maritime trade routes. The conquest of the continent became a catalyst for the development of European capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. The consequences of this historical shift are still felt in the global balance of power today. A single decision made by the commander on the shore of the bay became a turning point. Had the ships remained intact, the history of humanity might have unfolded according to a completely different scenario. The psychology of desperation forced a small group of people to operate at the limits of their physical and intellectual capabilities. They compensated for their small numbers with strict discipline, strategic planning, and political cunning. Their success is a classic example of how critical decisions can influence the course of world history. The history of the conquest of this continent is a story of organizational triumph and logistical calculation. The ability to manage chaos and build new systems under extreme conditions became the key to the formation of an empire. An analysis of these events proves that technological and structural superiority is more important than numerical superiority. The processes of transformation set in motion during that era laid the foundation for modern global civilization. This chronicle teaches us the importance of cold calculation in situations where everything is at stake. We've traced how the elimination of escape routes changed the course of world history and led to irreversible logistical shifts. Leave a comment with topics for future videos you'd like to see on our channel. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new analyses of historical and engineering strategies.